God, we give thanks for chances just to come together. To be in one another's presence, to be in your presence, to sing, to laugh, and most of all, to do what they said on the mountain, to listen to you. To listen to your word, to listen to your voice speaking inside of us, speaking through our world. Well, Lord, let us listen. Let us listen for your voice so that we may be transfigured too. Amen. Stephanie and I recently watched the first season of Percy Jackson. I've never read the books. I've never seen any of the old movies. I can't speak on if the show stayed true to the story, but that first season, it was really fun. For those that don't know anything about Percy Jackson, the stories are set in a world where the Greek gods live and work within our 21st century world. And Percy Jackson, like many of the kids in the story, are half-bloods or demigods. One of their parents is human, while another one of their parents is one of the Greek gods. And these half-bloods, they can see another world inside of our world. They can see creatures like satyrs and minotaurs and pegasus. And we learn as we watch the show or read the books that the Greek gods, they are still warring and feuding within this world that is inside of our world, altering our history, our fate in the process. It's an interesting story. Maybe I'll read the books this summer. But the show helped me think about the mystery of the Transfiguration a bit differently. Because much like in Percy Jackson, the Transfiguration teaches us that there is a world inside of this world. That there is another world, and it is in this one. As Nina mentioned, Transfiguration are those moments when you sense a sacred connection, a beauty, a holiness in everything around you. They are those moments when the veil between time and eternity drops away and God's goodness just shines through. And those moments, they can happen anywhere. They can happen in the car. They can happen as you walk along the beach. They can happen when you're strolling down a crowded street or gazing down from an airplane or just listening to music. They are those moments of radiance where you sense the grandeur of God all around. But I think most of the times our lives are just too frantic and too self-absorbed to sense it. William Butler Yeats had one of those moments, I believe, happen to him over a century ago while he was in a coffee shop. And he wrote about it in the poem Vacillation. My 50th year had come and gone. I sat a solitary man in a crowded London shop, an open book, an empty cup, on the marble tabletop. While on the shop and street I gazed, my body of a sudden blazed, and 20 minutes more or less, it seemed so great my happiness that I was blessed and could bless. Christians from the Celtic tradition, they call this phenomena thin places. Thin places are those moments when time and eternity embrace. They are those times when we just encounter God in a fresh way that startles us out of our attention, and we are just transformed by the experience. They are those encounters where we actually see God's world within this one, and it alters how we see everything around us. So this morning I want to look at a few different moments of transfiguration. A few different stories of people who encountered God at work in those thin places. Like Yeats in that coffee shop. And their lives were suddenly set ablaze by God's power and God's love, and nothing was ever the same. Years ago, I read a book about Ward Bream. Ward was a successful Minnesota businessman who had his life completely turned upside down one day after his pastor asked him after church one day, "How would you like to go to Africa?" The question completely caught him off guard. "He might as well have asked me," Ward said, "to go to the moon." The pastor sensed his hesitation immediately. He followed up, "Well, will you pray about it?" Ward followed up, "No, you're the pastor. You pray about it. I'll think about it." About 2 months later, the businessman found himself in an airport with a ticket booked to Ethiopia. It was him, a group of what he calls 10 older church ladies, and the pastor, and it wasn't looking good. But off he went, and in his words, "The moment I stepped onto African soil, my life altered forever." In Ethiopia, he listened to surviving family members tell stories of loved ones lost during the years of famine. In Uganda, he saw people everywhere dying of AIDS, and for the first time, the senselessness of people starving to death had overwhelmed him. Those first few days, they turned his world upside down. Everything, all the priorities that had been governing his life, he knew would have to change. And he began spending a significant portion of every year doing relief work in this new land. God found a way to get to him, he says. Sometimes God gets our attention with a pebble. Sometimes it takes a rock. And when that doesn't work, God throws a brick. Africa was my brick. Africa opened his eyes to an immense interconnected world that existed beyond his wildest imagination. That trip was his transfiguration experience. The moment that he experienced God's presence anew right within this world. And the rest of his life, he has devoted himself to supporting grassroots startups and entrepreneurs who are looking to better their worlds and the worlds of those around them. Desmond Tutu, in his wonderful book, God Has a Dream, shares a moment of transfiguration that happened in his life. During some of the worst days of the apartheid, Archbishop Tutu struggled against all the objective facts, all the failure, all the loss of hope that God was ever going to bring about a new beginning in his country. But he kept remembering that God is a God of justice who cares about right and wrong. Sometimes you had to whistle in the dark to keep your hopes up, he writes. And sometimes you wanted to whisper in God's ears, "God, we know that you're in charge, but can't you make it a little more obvious?" Tutu tells us that God did make it obvious. On one August 6th, which is the Feast of the Transfiguration in the Eastern Church's calendar, Tutu tells us that he was sitting in a garden in one of the theological colleges in South Africa when the evil of the apartheid was raging and weighing most heavily on him. It was winter there. The grass was pale and dry. Nobody would be able to believe that in just a few weeks, everything would be lush, green, and beautiful again. Nobody believed that life could be transfigured so fast. In the garden, there was a plain cross. Amid the brown grass and the leafless trees of winter, as he gazed upon that pale plain cross, he became utterly convinced that as God's transfiguring spirit works within nature, bringing fresh grass and flowers out of death, that this same transfiguring Spirit can bring about a new and free South Africa. The paths we tread may be dark, but we will have our moments of glory and revelation to show us the way. What God taught Desmond Tutu that day in the garden is that the principle of transfiguration says that nothing, that no one, that no situation is untransfigurable. That the whole of creation, that nature waits expectantly for transfiguration, and so do we. That we too will be released from bondage and that we will share in the glorious liberty as children of God. And that we'll be able to see the translucent world around us because of God's glory. I want to share one more moment of transfiguration. This one happened to the great monk, the great spiritual writer Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton saw God's transfiguring lights one morning, not while he was at the monastery or while he was deep in prayer. It happened while he was running errands in downtown Louisville, Kentucky. It happened at a busy intersection. It was a brief moment of revelation, one that completely altered the rest of his life. Here's how Merton described it in his journal. In Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of a shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I were theirs, that we could not be alien to one another even though we are total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness. If only everyone could realize this. There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun. This moment of transfiguration, while he was out shopping, it literally changed everything in the life of Thomas Merton. Merton quickly stopped being the world-denying monk that we find in 7-Story Mountain. Instead, he became the world-embracing monk who began devoting his life to addressing major issues plaguing his world at the time. He started writing and teaching about the horrors of war, about violence and racism and nuclear weapons in the Cold War and how they were ruining everybody. All because of that one moment of transfiguration, he says, right there on the street, that taught him that God's glory is found in everyone. Our gospel story presents us with another moment of transfiguration. A sacred day with Jesus and his 3 friends. Tension had been building in Jesus' camp with his disciples because Jesus had just talked about death and the cross and the fate that was awaiting him, and the disciples, they did not want anything of it. He and his disciples, they're exhausted. And they're worried about where things are headed. So Jesus takes his closest friends up to Mount Tabor, far away from the crowds. And here, he and his disciples, they experience something so strange, so mysterious that they don't even have words to describe it. Transfiguration. They see Jesus in a way they never have seen him before. Moses and Elijah, these great heroes of faith, are there with them. The entire experience must have seemed so overwhelming, so confusing, even frightening. The impulsive Peter, not knowing what to say, blurts out, "Lord, it is good to be here," and then suggests making 3 buildings to memorialize this event. Peter wants to capture this moment, to hold on to the glory. Peter urges Jesus to stay here away from the turmoil, away from all that talk about death. And then a cloud overshadows him, and they hear a voice declaring, "This is my Son, the beloved, listen to him." And then, just like that, it's all over. Like Yeats in that coffee shop, the moment vanishes. The veil between God and humans, it comes back down. This experience, this convergence of time with eternity, it provides Jesus, though, with exactly what he needs to continue onwards. To head down to Jerusalem where he knows the fate that awaits. These moments of transfiguration, they always seem to end the same way. They are encounters with the divine that alter the trajectories of our lives. They are moments, sometimes big, sometimes small, at those thin spaces where God gives us what we need so that we can continue down this path of faithfulness that we all are on. For many of us, Glendon Heights Mennonite Church is our own Mount of Transfiguration. It's one of those thin places where heaven and earth meet. Maybe not every week for us, maybe not even all that often. But it's a place where we encounter the divine, a place where we have sensed the God-filled humanity that we were made to become, and the God-filled universe that is God's ultimate vision for the cosmos. Like Desmond Tutu, here we have seen a vision of God's transfiguring power, and it helped us to imagine a future that is filled with God's light and God's love. When you and I arrived here this morning, we left behind a bit of the turmoil of our days to come into this glorious space, not for moral instruction, not to pick up a few pearls of wisdom, but we came to have our imaginations captured by words and music and transcendent beauty. We came to glimpse the glory and wonder of God, to open our eyes to the holy and to the oneness that binds everything together. Our world is perishing because of a lack of worship and adoration. You worship or you shrink. It's as brutal as that, as a character blurts out in Peter Schaeffer's play, Equus. We come here to open our eyes, to see the beauty of Jesus, and to enjoy the wonders of worship, so that just maybe we might be gathered into a vision of our transfigured Lord. But then, just like that, it's over. We gather here in this thin space to do exactly what God tells us to do on the mountain, to listen to Jesus, to listen as he shows us how to live in this world that is charged with God's grandeur, as he calls us to turn to those who are most in need, as he sends us to love our neighbor as ourselves, to welcome the stranger, to forgive and to be forgiven. And then in an instant, it's time for us to head back down the mountain, to finish our errands, to head back to the monastery. Just like that, the final sip of coffee is done and we must go about the rest of our day transformed and hopefully able to see our lives and our calling in a new way. As we leave this thin space today, know this: every one of us and every person that we will encounter this coming week is shining like the sun, whether we can see it or not. And Jesus, our transfigured Lord, is right here to lead us down the mountain, back to our worlds. And it is a world that everywhere is charged with God's radiant light.